Fearful Symmetry Fridays number 6, The Literal Trap. Now before I begin, I want to preface this by saying that I don't know the answer to the questions that are being brought up by this reading in Fearful Symmetry. And I think I say that in my slide. It's something I do have a position on, but it's something that I'm still thinking about. And the more I think about it, and the more I'm actually preparing a video about this in relation to Jordan Peterson. And the more I'm preparing for this video and going through some Heidegger and some Karl Barth and looking at how Jordan Peterson goes about things, the more interesting this question is becoming to me. And I'm not going to do too much of a summary this week. I'm just going to get right into the reading. I did the first 2 pages last week as sort of an introduction to this topic. And last week was primarily about dead facts turning into living truths, and how the imagination is so important in that. Now, in these next, I think I'm going to do like three or 4 pages. The reading is kind of large, and that's why I broke it up into several Fearful Symmetry installments. But you're going to hear some things in this reading that relate specifically to Blake's poetry, things like Orc and 27 churches, and things that are kind of specific that you might not have any idea about if you're not familiar with the poetry. But they're kind of incidental to the larger point that Fry is making about Blake and about religion and the Bible. So let me turn on my... Okay, so I think, I just went over that with this slide here about that. I'm not saying that this is... I'm not saying what's written here is the answer. I just want to emphasize that for anybody who is sensitive about this topic. But it's certainly interesting to think about, and keep in mind the idea of a literal trap. Now I shall start the reading. Try to get some good light here. This is usually my problem, is that the lighting I have is behind the book that I'm holding, and it's a ceiling light, so that's why I sometimes have trouble seeing what I'm reading. I'm trying to turn myself so I can get the proper light now. So Fry says, "What is true of the history is equally true of the law, which has always been read allegorically by the Christian. The gospel teaches us not to despise the letter of the law, but to read it as letters, spiritually, with the full energy of an active and intelligent mind. The law tells us to offer our first fruits to God. The corporeal understanding interprets that as a command to waste our best efforts in an attempt to bribe a ravenously greedy demon of the sky. The least touch of the imagination releases us from the act and gives us the anthropologist's insight into its meaning. The full imagination transforms the offering of first fruits into one of the archetypes of the human mind, the identification of the created thing with the God who made it. The Bible teaches us to read like this. It is the primer of a cultured and civilized man. It teaches us to see the sun not as a polished guinea, but as a company of angels, and it teaches us to see in the records of all past time not a chaos of tyrannies, but the eternal and eventually emerging form of human life, a form which is the larger body of man and of God. In Blake's symbolism, this is the redemption of the moral virtue of Palamabron, or Moses, by the prophetic power of Rintra, or Elijah, both of whom attend a divine man in his transfiguration. But, and here Blake breaks away from most of those who would agree with him thus far, the same contrast of law and gospel reappears in Christianity itself. If the Old Testament is transformed from the puerile to the profound by being read imaginatively, we can hardly plunge back into literalism when we turn to the gospel. The belief, with its implications, that Jesus existed on earth 2,000 years ago, which is the literal or historical core of the New Testament, is, whether in itself true or false, not the basis of the Christian religion. On this level, the essence of Christianity is the compulsory acceptance of a vanished event. And if we pull the words compulsory and vanished out of that clause, we may see that tyranny and mystery, the two marks of the beast, are still involved in such an acceptance of Christianity. It may be objected that while Julius Caesar and King Lear are equally products of Shakespeare's imagination, there is a considerable difference between the evidence we have for Caesar's existence and the evidence we have for Lear's, and that the distinction is something we should take into account in reading the New Testament. But it is that very distinction between what must have been true and what may not have been true that is the real trap for the imagination, and the New Testament goes out of its way to prevent us from walking into it. That is why we have 4 Gospels, with different and often quite inconsistent accounts of Jesus' life, and why the historical proofs for that life are hermetically sealed within the Bible itself. No evangelist has the slightest interest in writing a biography of Jesus. The Jesus about whom a biography can be written is dead and gone, and survives only as Antichrist. The evangelists tell us not how Christ came, but how he comes. They are concerned not with a vanished past, but with the imagination's eternal now. The timid will protest that we are here in danger of dissolving the reality of Christianity into a vaporous allegory. Blake's answer is that the core of reality is mental and present, not physical and past. Past events do not necessarily dissolve in time, but their existence in the eternal present depends on imaginative recreation. Each of the 7 Orc cycles, or eyes, of history bears a divine name representing the conception of God which it has. The Eye of Jehovah is in the Hebrew religious imagination. In Blake's Vision of the Book of Job, Jehovah and Job have the same face, because Jehovah is inside Job's mind. Milton's predecessor, Luther, understood something of this. He understood, too, that it was spiritually dangerous to be illiterate, and that the essence of Christianity is the direct individual recreation of the Word of God. But as he tried to replace the 26th Church with the 27th, he is now himself a part of what he condemned. The temptation of the churches could refer either to joining or reforming an old church, or to founding a new one. The latter aspect of it brings up a curious relationship between Blake and a number of new religions, which may have struck the reader already. Parenthetically, by this time, in the poem, Blake and Milton are the same person, and Milton's temptation is also Blake's. If Blake had told us that he had gone to visit the wise men of the East, and had learned from them the doctrines which he has set down in his poems, we should know what he meant, or ought to by now. When Madame Blavatsky tells us the same thing, we are not sure what she means. If Blake had told us that he had copied a vision of an ancient Atlantic continent from golden plates given to him by an angel, we should all know what he meant. When Joseph Smith tells us the same thing about the Mormon Bible, we are not sure what he means. When Blake tells us that the English are a lost portion of a spiritual Israel, or that pain and sin are an illusion, we can accept what he says without question. When Anglo-Israelites and Christian scientists expound what sounds so much like the same doctrines, unquestioning acceptance of what they say would commit us to a great deal more. All these churches start, from Blake's point of view, with a kernel of genuine vision, otherwise they would attract no adherents at all, but sooner or later a ceremonial literalism, or an acid test of compulsory belief in vanished events, appear in them as in every church. All such religions are exclusive, in the sense that however devoted one might be to any one of them, it would take a very impressionable person to believe in all of them. But the reader of Blake can see the real or imaginative form of each one of them, and disregard their non-poetic husks. If Milton or Blake had joined or founded a church, therefore, they would have lost the real church, the total vision, which is the city of God, and gained only a sect. No visible church will ever identify itself with civilized art, purge itself of all legal and historical conceptions of truth, and attain the absolute clarity of present vision. I'm just going to interject here. I wrote in the margin, maybe Fry never thought a church would do this, but I think Jordan Peterson's church might be doing this. That's just a side note for those who are listening only for Jordan Peterson stuff. So I will continue reading. In the long run, all churches are more interested in the rational than the creative aspect of the mind, in excluding from the truth of what they say the falsehood of what everyone else says, instead of including its truth, and binding together in a ceremonial and moral unity a chosen people of spiritual Jews. The source of their revelation has no such interest. Job is a dramatic poem, the Song of Songs a love poem, the Apocalypse an allegory, the teachings of Jesus mainly parables, and all the prophecy and doctrine is continuously visualized and illustrated. Only the poetic imagination can comprehend the Bible, and the Bible introduces that imagination to a mental world of inspired wisdom, culture, and beauty, in which all religions are one. I'm going to end this reading right here. There's still a few more pages before this part of the chapter is over, and you might find what was said so far sort of provocative, and I would agree. Or maybe you think it was nothing much. I wouldn't agree with that. And I'm going to cover the last part of the reading, I think, not in next week's Fearful Symmetry, but I'm going to carry it over to this video I'm doing about Jordan Peterson and his beliefs again. I did a sort of cursory attempt at explaining how he answers the God question, but I'm diving really deep into this now. I'm using this passage here. If you've seen this week's, this Fearful Symmetry and last week's Fearful Symmetry videos, that's the start of it. And like I said, I'm bringing in some Heidegger, and I'm going really deep into Karl Barth's Epistle to the Romans. And if you haven't heard of that book, at least in my opinion, it's one of the treasures that you're going to find in your life that make life worth living, as far as I'm concerned. So I'll be introducing that book there, and I'm probably going to start a weekly series from that video on Karl Barth's Epistle to the Romans from there, because I haven't read it in quite a few years, and every so often I'll pick it up again and start reading, and then I just can't stop reading it, and it's just so impressive. I've been putting up quotes from it on my Twitter. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at GoldJBP. I know it's confusing. It's not the same name I use here, Node, in a network. And there was a reason for that. I was really pushing the Gold Rush video at the time, and I thought that it makes more sense to do it that way. But anyway, I think I will end this here for now, and I will just leave it up in the air, and I really don't have an opinion yet on this passage. I just think it is certainly interesting to think about the literal trap. Maybe I will say 2 points, because I do have C.S. Lewis in the back of my mind. When Fry brings up the 4 different Gospels and how there are differing accounts in each of them about what went on, I don't understand why that's working against the idea of the historicity of the matters at hand, because if you were to get eyewitness accounts, they would be different, and what would be suspicious is if each account was exactly the same. Now, I know there are some the naive view is that there are four Gospels and 4 authors, four different types of witnesses. I'm not saying that in a naive manner. I know there's a source X for Mark or whatever, and there's some copying going on from a source that we don't exactly know of. But the fact that they're not all the same, to me, reveals that they weren't trying to come up with a story like guilty people might come up with a story about like where were they when the crime took place or something. They would get their story straight so that they wouldn't be found out. Similarly, these gospel writers were not trying to get the story straight. They each had their own account of what happened, and I think that adds credibility to the Gospels. It does not take away credibility from my perspective. There was something else that he mentioned there that I just thought was not an obvious. It was not obvious to me that it works against the historicity in the New Testament, but I just don't remember what it was. But anyway, I'll go more into that in this video about Jordan Peterson that I'm making, hopefully this weekend. It really takes hours and hours and hours to get these videos done, especially the big ones. I would say I've been working on this, the video I'm mentioning a lot now about Jordan Peterson, probably for 2 weeks and probably for like 25 hours. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to stop rambling now. Oh, yeah, I just finished watching Paul Vanderklay do an interview with, who was it now? I know his Twitter is Friends Forever. That was interesting. I'm glad he gave me a mention, and every little bit helps. He's really built up my channel with all of his favorable mentions, and I cannot thank him enough. So if you're here from Paul Vanderklay's channel, thank you. Thank you for checking out my video.